Yesterday, I saw Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, and for the last 24 hours, I've been trying to figure out why is it so good? And I think I've landed on three things the movie does that every filmmaker could add to their next project. Number one, repetition, but with a twist. Number two, camera philosophy, not just framing. And number three, leave it out. Let me explain. So repetition with a twist. Where do I even start? There's so many examples of this, but the basic philosophy of this is show the audience something in the beginning of the movie or in the earlier parts of the movie, and then show them that same thing later on in the movie, but in a way that changes the meaning completely or gives it added weight. So the examples of this are the Athena pin that Penelope gives Odysseus. Even Athena herself, played by Zendaya, her meaning changes when we see later her as this maiden who's being executed in Troy, with the setting sun's sort of dream that Penelope and Odysseus have for each other before he goes to the Trojan War, and at the culmination of the movie, the realization of that dream when Odysseus is now a changed man. There's so many instances of this. The reason why I think this is so effective is because we're introduced to this concept and familiarized to this concept, and I think when we first learn something, we attach to the meaning we ascribe to it initially. And then when it's shown either through different eyes or now in a totally changed world, the impact of that object and our familiarity with it just, an hour or so before hits us emotionally so much harder. I think the one that honestly really thrilled me and broke my heart was the sacking of Troy. So we see Menelaus kind of recount the sacking of Troy to Telemachus, and we see Odysseus running through and performing these heroic acts, and it sort of looked like a classic swords and sandals rampage scene through a city. But then when we see it through Odysseus's eyes, when he's talking to Penelope in the end, you see all the horrific aspects of that on display in front and center. It almost challenges ourselves as an audience when we see it that second time, because the first time we're all excited, we're rooting for Odysseus, we see them doing these incredible heroic things, and then when we're shown the texture of the horror that's happening there, we've almost let ourselves down as a viewer, and the emotional impact and weight of that, I think, hits us so much harder. I'm at the very beginning of my journey as a filmmaker, and Christopher Nolan is all the way at the top, God tier level. But this is a really simple story mechanism that I think as a writer-director, we can all benefit from. So repetition, but with a twist, I think is a very powerful way of showing change in a character, change in a world, and having that have emotional weight. Number two, camera philosophy, not just framing. So I think as, someone who's made a couple of short films, or anyone who's ever used a camera to try and tell a story, when you're thinking of framing a scene, you're really just thinking of the place you're in, the actors that are in it, the thing that you're trying to get across in that scene, and then maybe you just step back and think of what is the coolest or the most effective way to tell that story visually. And usually it produces pretty good results. But I think Nolan takes this a step way further in this movie. He doesn't just think of what's the best shot for the moment, but really he has an entire philosophy around what the camera should be to the audience. And I heard him talk about this in an interview where he's trying to put us into the action as if we were part of the scene. This has some unexpected benefits for him as a filmmaker and for his filmmaking style as well that I think are really, really important, especially for small budget beginner filmmakers. He likes to do everything practically, and there are a lot of instances where, let's say, a thing that would be a special effect isn't shown. For example, after the Cyclops is running after Odysseus and his men who are trying to get to their boats, we see the Cyclops in these really quick, shaky camera movements because the camera is someone in the action, right? It's almost as if one of Odysseus's men had a camera on their back and was running down this ravine with them, and we feel like we're part of the story. And because of that, we don't have to see a full, puppet or CGI reveal of the Cyclops in motion doing these crazy things with and interacting with the real world. We just see bits and pieces of this chaotic Cyclops puppet, and that's enough with sound design to make us feel like it's totally real, and it may be even more real than if it was CGI. Another great example of this, I think, is Scylla. So we pretty much only see Scylla's tentacles, and then when she crawls back into her hole. In like a classic, maybe modern movie, I'm thinking like Mandalorian and Grogu, you would see the entire Scylla in her fullest, scariest form. It would have to be all CGI, and it would take away from the realism of, the practical effect of Scylla, or even like add too much CGI of this like object presenting itself. But instead, because Nolan's philosophy is the camera is putting us into the center of the action as if we were actually there, all we see is the hand coming in, just like Odysseus and his men would see if they're on this boat and Scylla's picking off these guys from the boat. You don't need to show the whole Scylla. In fact, it doesn't make sense to show the whole Scylla, because if you do, you're no longer part of the crew. You're no longer on this journey with Odysseus. You're stepping back and you're sort of seeing this story unfold as if it was in a painting, and that takes you out of the moment. So it both adds realism, adds more emotion to the scene, and it has the added benefit of not making you not need to create a whole special effect or to announce a character in some really expensive way. You can just show bits and pieces of that character, because that's how you would witness it in the boat itself. And that's a philosophy you see throughout the movie. Even when we see Circe turning the men into pigs, you don't see like a full Animorphs man to pig transformation that would look super cheesy and would be very, very difficult to pull off without special effects or without CGI. It's just a very simple thing where we're in Circe's house, we're almost like peering behind her back one way or the other, and that allows him to do minimal CG or minimal sort of like in-story morphing, and you just see the steps of going from the hand to maybe it's a little bit hoofed on the other side to it's a full hoof. These progressions are shown, and it feels way more real because it is more real. It's like makeup and costumes and prosthetics, but just shown in this sequenced manner instead of like a rapidly evolving transformation that would probably make CGI necessary. When you're creating your next movie, like right now I'm writing my first feature screenplay. When I shoot that movie, I want to think about, where do I want the audience to be during the events of this? And can I keep that consistent throughout the movie so I can create a vibe or a feeling in that movie that is correct for the story I'm trying to tell? I think Alfred Hitchcock does a good job of this as well. Like when you watch Rear Window, obviously the entire thing is from the point of view of James Stewart's character, who is sitting in his room with a cast on and can't move, so you always see every character from his point of view. That's like a real literalization of this idea. But even something like Vertigo, it looks like you're stalking the characters as they go through this story, and it adds to this suspenseful sort of creepy vibe that it's giving off. So you got to think about, like, what's the story you want to tell? What kind of feeling and vibe are you trying to give with that story? And how can that come together in a camera placement philosophy throughout your story? I think that could really help no matter what kind of a filmmaker you are, if you're a beginner or, the master Nolan himself. And the third is leave it out. He doesn't explain what's happening in the scene. So for example, when Odysseus is on the island of the giants, I think in like a classic movie, one of the characters, or maybe even Odysseus himself, would say something like, "We got to get out of the trees. They're using the trees," right? You sort of see the trees shifting and caging his men in. And as an audience member, no one really tells you what exactly that is, and you're left thinking like, am I seeing things? Are those trees moving? And you're leaning into the story. You're trying to understand exactly what's going on. And he doesn't explain it in the moment, which I think makes you more engaged and adds to the mystique of the movie. As for Leave It Out, that's one that's really hard to master at first. I think it takes a lot of confidence and experience, but if we can remember when we're creating our stories, like the audience is pretty smart and you don't need to explain everything through a character or even like spend a lot of time visually, sort of visually explaining a thing, because sometimes it can even add to your story not to do that, right? If the audience is leaning in and they, let's say, they're 80% sure of what happened, but they're still sort of intrigued and trying to figure it out with you as the story is unfolding, I think that's really beneficial to you as a filmmaker, both from the point of view of like having your audience engaged and having them input what they think is happening in the story and being an active participant, but also like maybe that's like 30% less coverage you need to give of that scene, or like maybe that's, you don't have to show the entire Scylla's monster in Nolan's case, but you can just show some of the tentacles. That can come into play in maybe your smaller movie where you're not operating on such a grand scale, but you can scale back the amount of production needed by leaving certain things out, as long as the audience has some sort of understanding. You obviously don't want them to be totally confused as to what's going on, so leave a little intrigue, and use that to your advantage when it comes to how you're creating the movie and the budget you have. Even though these filmmakers are operating on this incredible scale, way far away from things that we might be making, I still think there are things that we can learn from them and incorporate into our movies that can really level them up. Hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoy the Odyssey as well.